the baseball offseason has hit that point where you're not really sure what the movement is going to entail, because not only are we dealing with an offseason, Chris, where a lot of teams are financially strained from this past season and you don't exactly know how they're going to spend. We really don't know. Okay, are players going to stay on the board as long as a Machado or a Harper a couple of years ago? Is it to that extent because of the COVID-19 situation we're in? Or is it a fluid, moving off season where you may have a Christmas present under your tree if you're a Mets fan? And that's normally the way it works with the big ticket items. I'm leaning towards the former, where we may not hear about a George Springer or a Trevor Bauer immediately. The market may run its course, and these players are going to have to gain a better sense of exactly what the interest level is, exactly how far teams are willing to go. And that's where we are. It's an uneasy time, I guess, as a Mets fan, because you are excited. You know Steve Cohen wants to spend. You have your shiny new toy, and every Mets fan loves it. Every Mets fan loves him. You don't know exactly when the dominoes are going to fall yet.
Yeah, you're right. I agree with you that it's the former, the first thing that you mentioned. Certainly you saw it with Machado and Harper, and that was really the beginning of a trend where baseball was already tightening its spending. And what the market is like now is obviously is far worse than it was then. You have teams that are indicating that they won't spend the way they did, but I think that was already setting in. Actually, I'll borrow a piece of wisdom from a guy named Scott Galloway. He's a business professor at the Stern School at NYU, and what he says about the pandemic as far as how it affects markets. And I'll even plug him. He has a great podcast called Pivot.
We should have him on.
Yeah, we should. I think he's a really brilliant business mind, but he talks about everything. And he says that the pandemic, more than anything, has been an accelerant of trends that we already saw. So you saw a massive transition to e-commerce. You saw basically the pandemic has moved every trend that had already set in 10 years forward. So, I digress a little bit, but I think that you saw a trend on spending in MLB. And you'll probably see it accelerated this offseason, where I think a guy like Marcus Stroman, who took the qualifying offer with the Mets, was smart. I think that was the bright move, because it's not going to be a robust market out there. All that being said, I wouldn't really bet on the Christmas present this year for the New York Mets. It might take a little longer. But if there is going to be a team that cashes in before Christmas, it would be the New York Mets, because they don't seem to be, and this is crazy to say, but they don't seem to be inhibited by the market or by even, the 100-year pandemic. They are the one team that seems to be an exception to that. And I don't want to get too out of myself, but they're the first mover on this market. They go out and get Trevor May. So that's certainly a sign. They're talking to Jake Odorizzi, who would be a really nice addition. Looking at catching help, starting pitching help. You mentioned Trevor Bauer, certainly high on the wish list. If there's going to be a team that can cash in early, it would be the Mets, even if it's not them early and they have to wait out the market, which we know Sandy Alderson is willing to do. I think that they will walk out of the offseason and we'll look at what they did and say they did more than anybody in baseball, if I had to bet.
Something that's wild, Chris, that struck me is, if you're a top free agent this year, let's leave aside if you're going to end up in New York Met, if you're going to end up in Flushing, you need the Mets to be involved. The Mets are not only a team that could begin the blockbuster type moves of this offseason, they are the mover of this market.
Right.
If you're Trevor Bauer, and this is wild to say this after years of ineptitude and penny pinching and that kind of thing in Mets land, if you're Trevor Bauer, you want, and you could argue you need, the Mets to be involved, because there are so many teams that are going to try to undervalue and underpay, and the circumstances vary per organization. But Steve Cohen and the Mets, it seems to be the one known of all these unknowns. They're going to spend. They're going to pay players what they're worth, and they will potentially overpay to bring someone like Trevor Bauer into the fold. So regardless of if Bauer ends up a Met, we are now in a situation where the New York Mets are dictating a lot of how this market moves.
Yeah, and it's so good for baseball. It's so good for us here in New York and our market. And myself as a fan couldn't be more, never have been more excited in my life. But you're also talking about something that's critical for baseball, because if nobody spent, then what happens to a Trevor Bauer? It would really be robbery if he didn't get the multi-year contract that he deserves. And even that, we'll see how the market defines itself. But you're right that the Mets may be the team that does define the market. I'll say this: it's really interesting to see Sandy Alderson almost publicly wooing Trevor Bauer, and Trevor Bauer, one of the more public athletes, using his own platform and even saying, "Yeah, I like what Sandy said about we're in the entertainment business." And you sense that Sandy Alderson is an unleashed personality. He gets to set the terms for how he runs this team as the team president under Steve Cohen, who's gonna cut the check. And that obviously was the opposite of the case when he was with the Wilpons. And you saw a guy who was, you could just sense it in his body language, probably didn't want to be there, and absolutely is a brilliant baseball mind and managed to build a pennant-winning team even with those constrictions. Here he is unrestricted, and that's very exciting. The other note on him is that he is running the show. He is running the show because this team does not have a general manager, which in itself is an interesting storyline. That what's happened in baseball is teams are really clamping down on their young talent, promising executives who might be a fit for a general manager spot. They're saying, you can't interview my promising young executive. So the Mets really haven't had a lot of access. And I was on the press conference, the Zoom call with Sandy. He really wasn't shy about the fact that we don't have a general manager, so I am running baseball operations here. I don't think that's something that Met fans should be worried about. I think Sandy Alderson's one of the best in the business.
Chris, I was about to ask, were we kidding ourselves to actually think that a GM search was going to happen? Because I feel like this is a Sandy Alderson project. I feel like this is I have the resources now. Let's prove I can produce a champion in my final few years in baseball. Now, I think it would really benefit the Mets in the next couple of years to have a prodigy of sorts under Sandy Alderson and have a mentor-mentee type scenario where someone can take the reins once Sandy Alderson, in an ideal world, produces that championship caliber roster. But I think we were fooled to even think that they were going to get the best and the brightest, like they were saying. I think this is Sandy Alderson's show, and I think it's going to be for the foreseeable future.
I think it is too, and that's probably why it is hard for them to draw the best and the brightest, because anybody who signs up with the Mets knows that they're going to be the number two. And a lot of guys don't want to be the lieutenant. At the same time, it's a very appealing job because Sandy Alderson has indicated does seem to be the type to take a back seat if it's not this year, the following, or the year after that. I mean, he is of advanced age, and I don't imagine him running baseball operations for that long. His capacity as team president, so he seems to be really involved with Steve Cohen and really involved with the business element here, which I'm sure he's learned a lot about over the years. So it's an appealing job because somebody has the chance to be the successor to him. At the same time, I wouldn't make that move knowing that it's the Mets aren't in any rush, put it that way. They're going to wait if they can get somebody, because right now I think they feel secure about Sandy and his lieutenants who he'll bring in. And I was a critic of his at times, but I recognize then, and I recognize even more so now that he had one hand tied behind his back the whole way.